Happy Hump Day, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode. I'm Piper Halp, and I'll be your moderator today. Unfortunately, Robert couldn't make it, but I will be hosting in his place. So we're here to exchange reliable, trustworthy information and share experiences with like-minded professionals in the Midwest hemp community so that we can all prosper in this new emerging market. So we have two excellent speakers today on this subject. Kia Adams, Adams Mikesh, Adams Mikesh, CEO of Adams Independent Testing, and Ryan Ballone. So first up, we have Ryan, who is the Commercial Director for Independent Hemp Testing Lab, KCA Laboratories in Nicholasville, Kentucky. Prior to KCA Labs, Ryan managed business development in international markets for a prominent dietary supplement testing laboratory with a focus on banned substance contamination prevention and mitigation. Ryan's presentation discusses a recommended process for identifying and choosing a laboratory partner. Ryan's presentation will compare laboratories and lab capabilities, assessing the quality of lab output, and more. So with that said, Ryan, go ahead and take it away.
I'm Ryan Ballone with KCA Labs here in Nicholasville, Kentucky. And like Piper said, I'll be covering choosing a lab partner. Go ahead and get started here. So what we'll cover is why the quality of a lab is important, when to use a lab, where to start with your search for a laboratory, and what kind of guidelines you should be following, assessing the quality of a lab during that process and even afterward, and then the results and marketing that may come with the laboratory itself. So a lot of us here have heard about the horror stories regarding laboratories, the falsification of results, missing the actual results, sorry, got my video going now. Missing the actual results that should have been analyzed and reported. So basically, there's two ways that a laboratory has this misinformation that they put out into the market. One's called dry labbing, where the laboratory fabricates the results and they're actually just made up numbers. They might look kind of accurate. You know, in an isolate, you might get 98% CBD, for example, when it actually wasn't even tested. And then also false negatives, where I guess throughout my history working with laboratories and at laboratories, we've always said, you know, any lab can see nothing. It takes a quality lab with validated methods to be able to see the results and report accurately. So an example of the falsification of results or just missing information in general is a case study here where we had a client of ours send in samples from remediated product for THC. Our client sent the samples to us as well as another well-known reputable lab over in the eastern U.S. And both labs, KCA and the other laboratory, reported that there was still presence of THC after it should have been remediated. The remediation company came back and said, okay, well, we have two lab results from that same batch that says that there's no THC, but we come to find out their limits of detection were higher than ours, and we provided the raw data as well as confirmatory analysis and triplicate runs to where we were able to prove ourselves with the data that there was THC present, while the other laboratories denied that. So ultimately, the takeaway here, beyond just a lab being able to see the results versus other labs that aren't able to see the results, is that the liability falls on the product owner for choosing a laboratory that is able to produce trustworthy results. So ultimately, the big thing to keep in mind is that you have to vet your lab. You have to trust your lab. You have to be able to identify a lab that is going to give you the results that you want, which is the accurate results, not the results that you need per se, with a THC remediation, of course, they want to tell you that there's no more THC. So when should you use a lab? It's different for all the different segments of the market. There's from nurseries and farmers, testing the plants themselves alongside like regulatory testing. If regulators come out to the farm and pick a sample from the cola of the plant, I recommend that you want to select a sample from an identical part of the same plant to test alongside that. You might want to test leading up to harvest, but even with nurseries, they'll want to test throughout the previous season to be able to market their seed and clones as having specific numbers regarding the cannabinoid potency. Processors want to test through R&D. They also want to test their finished product. Many of them, I'm willing to bet that every state is going to require that finished products tested by independent laboratories. And then retailers want to do spot checking on their own. I would recommend, if they're able to test product as they come in with their own C of A's at their own trusted laboratory. But what you want to do is develop a plan with your lab, and something that can fit your budget, fit your needs, and a good laboratory should be able to do that with you. So where to start when you're looking for a laboratory? Everybody kind of knows that you want to do cannabinoid potency testing, but when should you test residual solvents? When do you want to test pesticides? Is there research capabilities, clinical studies that you want to do on your own product? So those are some questions you want to ask of your lab. Turnaround time is obviously a big one. Lots of labs say 24 hours or 2 days. We heard earlier that it took a week. I know around harvest season, I've seen laboratories that take up to a month. So it's important to understand turnaround time with respect to your own needs. You need the results in 24 hours to get turned around so that you can make decisions about your product. What's the lab capacity? Do they have multiple machines, instruments to test the samples? And then most labs, I would say, offer some sort of expedited testing, usually for an additional fee. And that leads into cost. Lower isn't always better. It takes a lot of money and overhead to run a good, high quality laboratory. And so, maybe if you're wanting to do some spot checks along the way on your plants or on your material, you might want to pay a lower fee. But if you are trying to market your product and sell material and product with an independent lab's C of A, you're going to want to have a high quality output. I would argue that having that same laboratory all along the way will help you with your assumptions, your predictions, and your development of product. You can also ask for volume discounts and bundle discounts if you're testing, cannabinoids, terpenes, pesticides, etc., all at once. So speak with the lab, see if they offer any discounts. They might want you to engage in a long-term testing contract for several months or years to get prices down. And then farmers and processors, everybody has to be licensed. So labs do too. So check for their state license. ISO 17025 is a standard for chemical testing, and labs should strive to meet those requirements. Excuse me. There's also DEA registration for labs to be able to handle, let's say, hot hemp after it's been tested, to handle it legally. So moving on, we have some specifications to consider. Everybody kind of hears about limits of detection, LOD, and limits of quantitation, LOQ. MU may not be as common, but that's measurement uncertainty. So with limit of detection, that's when the number at which a laboratory can actually see an analyte with some degree of confidence. It really comes into play when we're talking about contaminants like pesticides or residual solvents, where you want to be able to see if it's there or not. And if it's there at a lower level than the LOD of a laboratory, that should be a concern. You want to test as low as possible for a lot of these, or at least meet the guidelines for the state that you're in or the states that you'll be selling in. Limit of quantitation comes into play when you want to profile the product. So it's basically what value and what minimum value or defined value can you give a certain analyte based on the methods and capabilities of a laboratory. So you want to know, for example, all the different minor cannabinoids on some biomass. Maybe you'll want to check on CBG, for example. You'll want to and THC and CBD should be commonly tested by labs, but and THC should be tested at least at 0.3%, and should be much lower than that by any laboratory. But with the CBG, for example, if you want to see a very low amount, if it's even there, to start identifying if a certain cultivar is worth pursuing later on down the road for certain analytes, that would be important. And then measurement uncertainty, I like to think of it as the error of testing at a laboratory, where, let's say, for example, you get results on some hemp. Let's say it's 0.31% THC, and right away you think, oh man, I have some hot hemp. But the measurement uncertainty comes into play here, where, let's say, the measurement uncertainty there is like 10% of that value, and that has a chance to bring the value below the 0.3%, and you can argue scientifically that your hemp is not hot. So keep that in mind. Some other things to consider. Many labs include internal standards with their testing. These are analytes that are added by the laboratory for their own quality control. We add one to the end of the run on the instrumentation, so that you put a defined amount of some sort of compound into the aliquot, and when you test it, you should see that predefined amount pop back up on the results, and that just shows that the run completed, as well as it completed without any issue that you can tell by that internal standard showing up. So ask the labs if they include such quality controls. Proficiency testing is something that every lab needs to be doing. These are tests that you perform by purchasing samples from typically an ISO 17043 accredited body, such as Pernova, for example, or even here at the University of Kentucky down the street offers a proficiency testing program that a lot of people participate in, that ends up, you get these samples, they've already spiked it or determined the levels of the cannabinoids or the pesticides, and the laboratory is supposed to report back what the analytes they found and at what levels, to be able to show the capabilities of a lab. Labs should be doing this internally as well. Their quality department should be spiking samples and sending it through the lab blind to the scientists, so that they report back, and quality should check that. And then even clients do it. We have clients all the time sending us samples that they know the amounts already, that we should be reporting, and that's a way to test the quality of your lab. If the expectation that you have going in is reported by the lab, then they've met that requirement. On the right there is a chart of the proficiency testing results from the University of Kentucky's program. And you can see the wide range of results, the black marks there being the actuals, and significant outliers being in red there. So the labs, as you can tell on here, are all over the place with the results. And then the final thing is on here is Independent versus in-house. In-house is great, but it carries some conflict of interest as well as bias. And independent testing, third-party testing is required by regulatory bodies all over the country. So it's viable to use in-house labs or use labs at other processors or whatnot, but always keep in mind the importance of using an independent laboratory.
So Ryan, while you're on the subject, we do have a question. What is a common measure of uncertainty levels in the industry?
So there's a universal level here that's put out there, that's basically going from the 0.3% THC up to 0.4 for determining marijuana, down to 0.2 determining hemp. So that's a universal measurement uncertainty that's being used, but each laboratory should have their own. They should be able to tell you what their measurement uncertainty is. It's a requirement by ISO 17025. It's something that they have to calculate. It changes over time. So really, the more narrow measurement uncertainty that you have shows the quality of the lab. There's not as much error with regards to the testing, with regards to the results. If it's wider, maybe it's nicer to have that for the regulatory testing, especially if you're right there at the cusp of 0.3% THC. But I think, as this industry develops and there's more regulations, we'll start to see that you need to have more specific results.
Okay, thanks.
So continuing on with assessing the lab. So you should, beyond just the things that we've already talked about, the due diligence that you perform. From my experience in the dietary supplement industry and working with GMP facilities, we had a lot of clients that did their own lab audits. And, I'm not going to sit here and say that everybody should be auditing their lab or going on site to their lab and asking questions that really it's hard enough to know the answer to. But having some checklists that you can assess labs with regarding, their accreditations, their experience, what equipment are they using? Is it new or used? Where did it come from? Do they have service contracts? Do they have multiple instruments? What's their backup plan in case of catastrophic failure? What if an instrument goes down during harvest season when you want results quickly? Do they have a backup plan? And then obviously gauge the relationship. Are you getting good customer service? Are you getting good feedback? Are they responsive? Do you trust this lab based on your initial reactions or interactions, I should say? So, there's examples of this online, but as the industry moves to be more regulated, especially if the FDA steps in quite a bit more with, similar to GMP style quality systems, this is something that I see the industry moving towards over time. And so some of you have probably seen these chromatograms. It's basically the visual output of the instruments by laboratories. We put them on our C of As. Not everybody does, but it is a good way to see the quality of a laboratory's output. The number of peaks will end up showing how many analytes were assessed. So here on the left is ours here at KCA. We have 18 analytes on our cannabinoid potency screen, and then over here on the right is the internal standard that we use. So it shows up at the end of the run saying that the run's complete, that we've recovered all our analytes. The baseline resolution, you want as flat a line as possible. You don't want it kind of shows interference, how clean the extract and sample preparation was by the laboratory team. And then and here on the right is an example of the baseline resolution moving up and having some interference, as well as co-eluting is another important one. We have some occurring here at the bottom here. You want the peaks to go back down to baseline. Here on the right, which is extracted from an actual standard that's out there, a laboratory standard that's published. Their peaks don't go all the way back down to baseline. So it would just have some interference and possibly the actual values may not be completely accurate. Another thing I want to touch on is the issue with pesticides. I know I get questions about it all the time. Why do we test for so many pesticides? You know, we're not in California. You know, they're not allowed anyway. That kind of thing. It's basically to understand, you know, regards to safety for the end users. You don't want pesticides in a product, and it needs to be remediated if there is pesticides. There's cross-contamination that does happen, inadvertent contamination from spillover from other farms, and you know, maybe you have a worker that uses it accidentally or something. You just want to make sure that you're testing for them and that they're not there. And if they do show up on your results, then, you know, ask your lab for help to understand that and come up with a plan to identify, you know, where did it come from? Did it come from one side of a field that's next to another field that's spraying pesticides? So there's good ways to identify some issues there. You know, so what I like to say is that, you know, farmers, you might not be concerned about contamination from pesticides, but your clients are going to be concerned. They're going to test your product for pesticides, and then of course the end users are going to be up in arms about it. You don't want to be in the news for pesticides like a lot of companies have been. And then finally here this is a copy of our certificate of analysis. So the laboratory output, yeah, it's just a piece of paper, usually a PDF that you get sent that should have, and Kia will touch on this to greater extent, that should have all the results on there. There's no guarantees, and with regards to testing, you know, you'll have your service agreement with your laboratory, so make sure you read that and understand, you know, even the testing specifications that there a lot of labs are should be giving out alongside C of A's, so you can better understand what they mean. So this is a good way to compare to other labs. And then the marketing tools that you're given, do they give you QR codes that you can put on your product? Do they have some sort of certificate verification on their website? You know, can an end user send a copy of the C of A to you, and the laboratory will confirm, yes, that's an accurate C of A. And then some labs also do some logo licensing where you can put their logo on your product if you do testing with them. So, so yeah, that's all I've got for now. And yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Ryan, for your presentation. It looks like we do have a question, and it's, where can I find a source for actual pesticide heavy metal thresholds for hemp? I have seen ones for marijuana and was told that is being used for in-house standards, but I would like to see actual levels for hemp.
Okay, yeah, so that'll be with your laboratory. It'll be the LOD and LOQ with what they're testing. If you're, let's say, with California, for example, in their regulations, they'll list out what pesticides they test for. They should also list off any thresholds that they're testing to. Here in Kentucky, they don't have. I don't think they have any allowable pesticides at the moment. It's basically you know, herbicides and you know, natural sprays that you can put on the product for now. But yeah, it's going to be state by state, and hopefully when the FDA steps in with the hemp industry and CBD and all that stuff, we'll see some better guidelines federally.
Marguerite, do you know of any sources for these thresholds in Indiana?
I do not. And then there was a follow-up question, are there any USDA thresholds published? From what I understood, at this point, it's kind of up to the states. And in Indiana, our Department of Health has been fairly quiet on thresholds for heavy metals or any kind of pesticides. And even though Ryan made a good point that the products that people are applying are, you know, what we could consider natural products, there is, you know, the potential concern of drift because we have so many different crops produced in our state. So lots of extraction companies are testing, but they are making their own thresholds based on, other states that they've heard of like Colorado, or California or Massachusetts, or any state that has a threshold. They're trying to turn to those to make a determination. But I don't know when Indiana is going to have, set thresholds. There's the U.S. Pharmacopoeia that has cannabis threshold recommendations, but those aren't requirements. Those are just guidelines. And lots of natural products and extracts from other plants will, get certification through the USP program, but it's not a requirement. So I don't know when we're going to have, set standards across the U.S. for these different kind of contaminants.
And we're going to move on next to Kia Adams-Mikesh, CEO of Adams Independent Testing. Leveraging her deep industry knowledge of federal regulations, testing operations, and software innovation in the grain industry, Kia helped establish Adams Independent Testing, one of the first hemp testing laboratories in the state of North Dakota. She established it with quality customer service and passion in mind, being one of the few labs to give 1 to 2 day turnaround times. Kia will talk about how to read a COA, how to avoid fraudulent COAs, and field sampling strategies. So with that, I'll give it to Kia.
Hi, as she mentioned, my name is Kia, and today I'm going to go through the certificates of analysis, and I'm going to sprinkle in, when I'm talking about each area, how you can spot fraudulent COAs as well. It's something that we get a lot of questions on, and people are very curious about. It's surprising, but there are actually quite a few fraudulent COAs out there where people have altered them in one way or another. So this is just a quick example of what a first page of our COA looks like. It's important to note that every certificate of analysis is different depending on the lab. There isn't a standard form or regulated way that we need to do these, but there are definitely regular things that are on the majority of COAs, and there are things that you should see on COAs as well, and I'll go through those. So I'm going to break this out into different sections so we can actually dive in and see every little area of the COA. So in this one, we have, it's going to show what lab did it. That's very important to know what lab did the testing, so that when you are buying product, you know who to call to see if it is a legitimate COA, and that gives you a lot of knowledge there. Most COAs have some sort of information on it. They should have who it was that the client was that had you test the product. Not everyone has the address and phone numbers and things of that nature, but some do. This is good to know. Actually, most labs, depending like with ISO and stuff, you're not supposed to change who the client is. So this is something we actually see people, they don't like other people's information on there. They may take a COA from someone else, and even though it's a similar product, they may have just taken, they bought some buds from someone else and then they packaged it their own. They will want that COA to actually say their name on it. So I've seen it quite often where people will take this and manipulate it and Photoshop it into saying their name, and that is being fraudulent. That shows that they tested it and they didn't actually test it. So they don't know in what means the other person did. Then we have down here is the sample name, and the sample name is what the client gives the lab to put. So the lab doesn't actually give the sample a name. So we do recommend that the names are done in a way that are identifiable. So I've seen people just putting 1, 2, 3. I wouldn't recommend doing that. You're going to want to put something that helps you know and understand what it is. I see some people saying this was untrimmed buds, trimmed buds, biomass. They just kind of, from this field, you may want to put different field names, or just any identifiable information is good. Some COAs will also identify what type of product it was. So in this one particularly, it says it was plant biomass and it was grown outdoors. They can show that it was grown indoors, if it's an extract of some sort. So this will help you identify if it matches the product that you're receiving. Then over here, this sample is just a unique identifier for the lab. So a lot of labs will have a unique identifier that we choose of our own, usually in just a randomized order. And that if we get that ID, then we're able to go back and check in our records and make sure it's the exact same one. I think it's really good to put what strain it is in there. Strains can vary quite a bit on their testing when you're talking about cannabinoids. So a lot of people will do testing by strain, so you can put that on there. Batch number and the batch size, that's something that when you are buying product or you're selling product, I think that's a really great way to show that you're taking your quality really seriously. A lot of the GMP standards, the manufacturing standards, just quality things, will have you batch your material, and that's how you'll test it, is you test each batch. And so this shows, for one, it helps show the COA and connect it back to your quality standards, but it can also show people you're selling to that you have a trail of your quality. It's also good to really make note of the dates, because I have seen people trying to sell stuff based on things that were from 2018 and like right now. And so tests don't last that long. Like the product can change quite a bit over time. And so you're just watch that and see if it's something that you're comfortable with, how long the date has been since it was tested, especially with biomass. If it's not stored properly, that product can change quite a bit, especially when you're talking about mold. And those different things can also change the cannabinoid profile as well. Then you get to the QR code, which honestly I feel, and most labs feel, is one of the most important parts. This is going to be the best way to show if your COA is fraudulent. So if you get a COA and it has a QR code, my recommendation is the first thing to do is to take your phone and scan that QR code and verify that the information is the same. And because if you are going through and someone's manipulating this and maybe changing the CBD percentage to be a bit higher so they could get more money, it's not going to change in that QR code. Now, the one thing to note, though, is that when you are looking at the QR code, you're really going to want to make sure that it's going back to the lab's LIMS system or something that looks reputable. So for us, we use Confident Cannabis as our LIMS system. So when you scan that QR code, it will bring you back to Confident Cannabis, and you can see that in the URL. If it is easy to make a QR code. So someone could go make a QR code with their new COA that they did and then put a different QR code on here. But that's likely going to bring you to a free QR code program. So just be very cautious about that. And if you have questions about it, feel free to call the lab. They'll be able to tell you where their QR code should go, and then you'll be able to look into it in more depth. Then you're going to get into usually the front page in the hemp industry is the cannabinoids. And there are generally call-out boxes up here that will have total THC, total CBD, possibly total cannabinoids. There can be a few different items. The most important thing to note with these is they're not actually analytes that are tested by the lab. They are analytes put into an equation. So total THC, if you're testing with an HPLC, isn't actually an output from the testing that you're doing. And if you go down, most labs, you should, especially with ISO, you should have your equations spelled out. And something that I've seen also on the fraudulent end is that they may change some of these items, but they don't change them down here below, or they don't change some of the items because they don't know how they interact with one another. And so you can tell by actually plugging these numbers into the equation that they manipulated the product, or they manipulated the COA. When you go through, you see all these different analytes. There's the acidic, neutral forms. There's all the different types. For total THC, which is a question we get frequently, the regulated formula or equation for that is delta 9 THC, and then you add it with 87.7% of THCA. And that's what the USDA has been using for the formula. And so And then you can see here, there are the percentages, and that's what most people are used to seeing, especially in the cannabinoids. So that one's usually pretty easy. But then a lot of times we'll see milligrams per gram. So if you were to have a serving size or how big your product was, you can multiply this out by the amount of grams it is, and then that's going to show you how many milligrams of that cannabinoid is in that product instead of just putting the percentage on there. That's something that a lot of retail products are looking for. And then the really important part is the LOQ. So Ryan touched on the LOQ, but this is it kind of used in real life that you'll see on a COA. So here for our cannabinoids, we have 0.001 for LOQ. So we can get down to 0.001% in order to see for what these are. So I'm going to show you on this next one why that's important. So these are two very real COAs that have occurred. And the first thing that I noticed when it was brought to me is that, well, the first thing I noticed is it said total THC non-detect, and the CBD is 13.67%. That should be a red flag to anyone. I personally, and I'm sure most labs would say this, I have not seen a non-detect with a proper LOQ with that high of a CBD percentage. Just with how the plant is, it doesn't really work that way. So I went down, and the next thing that I looked at with that being a red flag is the LOQ. And you can see here that the LOQ is 0.1%. Now remember, the one previously was 0.001. So this means when you actually take for the total THC, the delta 9 and then the 87.7% of THCA, and you take that for this LOQ, it's approximately 0.186% that this total THC can be while still being non-detect. So this very easily can be 0.186% total THC, and it's still saying non-detect, which is extremely misleading for people who are buying it. But where you're going to see this most often is when people are trying to sell you seed, because they're trying to show you, hey, my product got all the way up to almost 14% CBD, and you weren't even close to hot. And the problem with that too is what you're going to get into is you think that there's no way your product is going to get hot. So you're probably not going to do proactive testing as much. So it has got people, and they have had to destroy their crops over things like this because they did not think it was even an option that they needed to test their product, that they needed to test it. So now you get, that one to me was pretty bad. And then I scrolled down and saw that this one here had an LOQ of 2.24%. And this is, by seeing that, it shocked me because, I mean, that is about 4% total THC, a little under that you could get total THC and still be non-detect. And that would obviously be extremely hot. And I was like, could this even be? Well, it's likely that this lab is a marijuana lab. And a 2.24% for an LOQ, that's nothing. So that's totally fine because those are usually in 20% or higher. But for hemp, that is the difference of you needing to destroy your crop or not. So LOQs are very, very important. And if anything looks off, make sure you look at those. Then there's a summary a lot of times on COAs, and this is just going to give you a really quick idea of if things passed or failed. And you can see here, it'll say that residual solvents were not tested. That's something that's not tested on plant material. The mycotoxins passed, the heavy metals failed. So instead of having to be able to read a COA very intensely, you can get a very quick overview and then know where you need to go into further. This I wanted to show just what a pesticide would look like. This is 1 out of 3 or 4 pages of pesticides. As Ryan noted, there are many pesticides. Definitely look at the LOQs. That's very important. But then also look at the limits. These limits are going to be like the action limits. So for us, we test off of the Oregon standards. And the reason why we do that is for us personally, we've just found it to be the most universal one because there's no federal standards yet. But going off of that, if you are above like 0.4 parts per million on this one, so this one was at 1.3, this mass is what the actual result is from your product. that 1.3 is above 0.4, so that means it would fail. And this one, I was asked to put this one in there because terpenes are just interesting. They're kind of a hot topic a lot of times. With terpenes, you're going to have the same with the LOQ, but a lot of times people are more interested in the milligrams per gram because the sample is, you really look at it like that, especially if people are trying to extract the terpenes out of there. But then, like for ours, we have it in order of the top to the lowest, and then we tried to extract it out so you can see this one has more of a hoppy aroma and cinnamon and pine, so you can kind of equate what myrcene is and what each of them are, since they're the scientific words. Then with all of this, with the COA, your COA is only as accurate as the sample you were given, as accurate as the sample the lab was given. So when the lab is getting a sample, we're testing what we're given. So when you're going out, and if you are a producer or farmer and you're wanting to test it to make sure that you're in compliance with the state, you're going to want to go out and sample it exactly how the state would sample it. And that means if they are doing it in a zigzag pattern or a sawtooth pattern, you're going to want to go out and do that. If they're doing the top 6 inches or the top 4 inches, make sure you're doing it in that manner and sending it in how the state would send it in. This is very different though, because we had a lot of farmers that were coming and they're like, well, you know, we had X percentage for CBD when we were doing these samples throughout the season. And now when we're getting it down into biomass, our percentage is substantially lower for the CBD. Well, that's because the tops of the plants, middles, and the bottoms are all different values. And especially when biomass, you're usually getting more stems, more leaves, which have a lot lower CBD content or cannabinoid content in them. So if you are looking for how much money am I going to get out of this, and throughout the season trying to test that, you're going to want to sample it by testing the tops, the middles, and the bottoms, and getting those leaves and the stems in there and trying to get it as representative as possible. So just a little recap is how to tell if your COA is fraudulent. Those are all the different parts of it, but some of the notes are: make sure you always check the QR code every single time. Always check the QR code and make sure that it's one from a reputable place, that the URL makes sense where it's coming from, but that it matches the PDF that you were given. Check that the picture on the COA, so when we were on that first page with talking about the cannabinoids with those call-out boxes, you saw that I had a picture of some plant material there. That's actually one of my favorite ways to tell if something makes sense or not. And it's not as necessarily a fraudulent way, because another thing that I see often is that people just send in for testing, they just send in the buds. And that's not necessarily fraudulence. Some people know that those are a lot higher because they don't have leaves in it, so they're doing it to get higher content. So there's definitely people that play the game, and then there's people that just aren't aware of it. But that picture is going to allow you to know when you're looking at a product, see if that picture matches the product you're getting if you are on the buying end. And because I have seen that many times of if they don't have a picture, just from seeing so many COAs, I can tell if something was purely bud just by looking at the results. But you'll be able to know pretty quickly if it's just a few pictures of buds in there and the COA does have a picture and you're getting biomass, that it's not going to match. And you'll be able to do that before even buying the product if you look at the COA. So very important to look at that. Some people also try to pass off some of the different COAs throughout the cycle for the next cycles. So it'll just let you know what product was actually tested, because those test results can be very different depending on the phase the product is in. Definitely look for the LOQ on all COAs for all tests. This happens very, very frequently, that the LOQs are a lot higher than they should be. So essentially you're not even really getting the test that you're asking for, because what you need is below an LOQ that they are maybe giving you. So that is something you can ask the lab what their LOQ is, and fully read all equations used, because just a quick example of how something that happened with us is there were a few different labs being used between parties, and they were buying and selling, and they couldn't understand why they were coming out differently. And I knew this other lab, I knew they were very reputable as well, and we always match up. And I had actually sent quality samples back and forth with them, and we'd never been off. And so I couldn't figure out where they were getting at. So I asked for the actual COAs, and what was happening is the other lab had more of a call out of total cannabinoids. And at that time, we had a call out of total CBD. Well, because cannabidiol is very similar of a word to cannabinoids, they were taking cannabinoids and cannabidiol and comparing them apples to apples. So that's where looking at the equations is really important, because you may not be comparing the exact same thing that you think you are. So and so actually looking at the real analytes in there and seeing what those percentages are very important. Oops. All right, and that's all I have.
Well, great. Thank you, Kia, very much for your presentation. It's always helpful to learn how to digest a COA. I noticed earlier in the presentation you said 14 point something is much higher than the CBD you typically see. What are CBD percentages you're typically seeing that make sense?
Yeah, so it really depends on the area of the country. I know up here in North Dakota, we had a rough year, so I was seeing more in that 7% when they were getting closer to 0.29. But in other areas, I don't see it a whole lot above that 10, 11%. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but if you are getting a lot above that, I would question it. For biomass and stuff, I would just look at it as a red flag. And that's how I like to look at these things, is it's not meaning something is manipulated or fraudulent, but trying to understand what red flags are to make you question things more, to look into it further.
Definitely. And then I guess one other question was, do you have any ways of looking at a COA digitally and seeing if it's been manipulated via like previous history of saving or anything like that? Or is that kind of off the table?
You know, I know PDF sometimes you can see those things. So if someone manipulated it wrong, I guess, not very well, you can possibly see that. But a lot of times some of these are pretty sophisticated, and so they think of that because you can print and, well, I shouldn't give all the tips, but there are ways to get around that, so it doesn't always mean that.
Yes. Well, does anyone else have any questions for either Kia or Ryan? Okay, well, with that, we really thank you for both of your information and all the resources that we can use. As always, these presentations and the video will be available online. A list of our future sessions, we are continuing this webinar series, so a list of our future sessions are available on our Eventbrite page. We'll have our agenda with each speaker and what topic that they're going to be discussing. Next week, our speaker is with Christy Apple with Crop Scouts. She will pick up where Dr. Petrus and I left off. We talked about how to hit the ground growing, the pros and cons of seeds, seedlings, and clones, and considerations for hardening and transplanting. Christy is going to talk about how you keep your crop growing, irrigation, fertilizers, pests, weed control, anything about maximizing your yield. So we appreciate everyone's support. We thank you for being here. I'm Piper Halpin, reminding you to be healthy, be happy, be healthy, and be kind out there right now. And we'll see you next Wednesday at noon Central for my Hump Day.